So I'd like to introduce our first speaker today, and welcome to those who are just joining. We've had the introduction, and we're about to start our presentation. So Richard King is our first speaker. Richard is the author of several pieces of literature, including Brittle with Relics: A History of Wales, 1962 to 1997. And Richard will be examining the social energies imagining communities across Wales during the fight for the survival of Cymraeg and the fight for economic stability in a fast deindustrialising society. Over to you, Richard. Thank you.
Diolch, Jessie. Croeso pob. This will, by its nature, be something of a sort of greatest hits of Welsh resistance. I'll start with events in 1962 and finish with devolution, and then say a few things about post-devolution Wales that may inform a degree of how we think about the country we live in today. You're great, thank you. Thanks, Kelly. So 1962, as I'm sure many of you know, the former leader of Plaid Cymru, Saunders Lewis, gives a radio speech, Dyhead, Cymraeg, Survival of the Welsh Language, in which he states that Cymraeg will not survive unless revolutionary means are undertaken. He didn't go into too much detail about what those revolutionary means should be, but it was, to all intents and purposes, something of a call to arms. This speech was very much given cadence by events around what was happening in Tryweryn, the village we see here, and the flooding of the dam for water for Liverpool, and the effectively the clearance of this community, which was a Cymraeg-speaking community, despite a great resistance from many MPs sitting in Parliament. But it highlighted the fact that communities such as this lacked any political agency and were effectively told to leave their homes. Obviously, Tryweryn has become hugely symbolic. We could almost say it's become something of a meme in terms of the coffee of Tryweryn. It's the sort of keep calm and carry on of Cymraeg action, which is good, really, because it's saying the opposite to keep calm and carry on. Anyway, the events around Tryweryn and Saunders Lewis's speech also galvanised the formation of Cymdeithas Cymraeg, the society, the Welsh Language Society, which I always feel is possibly better translated as the Society of the Welsh Language. We'll see footage, picture of them in action in a moment, but just to say, this was very much something in the air, as you all know, in the late 60s, of energies around civil disobedience, ranging from light-hearted student politics to the events of 1968. But I think we have to see that that energy did arrive in Wales in the form of the need for Cymraeg to survive. So that's happening around 1962, 1940, the mid to late 60s in Cymraeg speaking areas of Wales, North Wales, Northwest Wales, West Wales, everywhere, where Plaid's electorally successful to this day. Meanwhile, if we could have the second image, please, Kelly. In a year or two, around that time, the mid-60s, 66 to be exact, we have the cataclysm of Aberfan. This photograph taken by David Hearn, as well as seeing the almost imaginable suffering and horror. This picture, I think, is so indicative of the effect Aberfan had on its community, because we see these two school children at the front of the image looking at the disaster and all that's been wrought. And also what they're seeing is the fact that the way of life they've grown up in of secure employment in industry in South Wales has been removed, is no longer tenable. And I think many historians agree that Aberfan now can be seen as the moment where the contract between the state and its workforce, particularly in areas like industrial South Wales, where the state played such a role in employment, that this contract was broken here at Aberfan. And these two children are seeing that. It's worth bearing in mind 1969 was the year of highest employment in the United Kingdom in the 20th century. And obviously, during the mid-60s, the standard of living people enjoyed was very high. It was economically very successful period for most people participating in the economy in Britain. And Aberfan, as well as the social humanitarian disaster, can be seen as the moment where economic decline, the contract in areas like South Wales, began to dissipate. So there are two animating energies going through this period, the mid to late 60s up until devolution. On the one hand, we have an energy prompted by ideas of almost revolution with Cymraeg, and that's a youthful energy full of purpose and a mission. Then we have another energy that is an energy of decay, of decline in South Wales, where deindustrialization is looming. The question is, how will its effects be felt? And that is an energy, unlike the energy in the Cymraeg areas, that is an energy of essentially fear and worry and a sense that a moment is passing. Could we have the next slide, please, Kelly? And here we have Cymraeg, Cymdeithas Cymraeg activists, squint, and this, I don't know if it could quite be Paris 68, but squint, and you can see people dressed in late 60s clothing, long hair for both genders, getting into trouble with the police here as part of the road sign campaign. In 1969, the works of both Gandhi and Martin Luther King are translated into Cymraeg. And this has an effect on Cymdeithas Cymraeg because the society decides to be a non-violent direct action group. So they will take action like the dismantling of road signs, but they will be non-violent. People won't be hurt in the process. In a few minutes, I will argue that Cymdeithas is effectively an incredibly successful organization. Their activities will carry on throughout the decade, throughout the 70s. Their activities will become elided with things like the Maybe on Glyndŵr campaign, purely because both activities are undertaken using Cymraeg. There's no evidence there was much of overlap. Obviously, in the case of Maybe on Glyndŵr, there's no evidence of anything much at all. Can we have the next image, please, Kelly? And here, just as we're leaving the 60s and entering the 70s in Wales, I think this is a picture that speaks to our current moment in myriad ways. This is a photograph taken at CAT, at the Centre for Alternative Technology in Ymhyrchu. One of the things I find very interesting about this, and there is no value judgment said in this, but as far as I've been able to establish, not one of these people is from Wales. They've all moved here during the early 70s to participate in the energy and the ethos of environmentalism at work in Ymhyrchu. Wales is one of the first nations to include sustainability in its national charter when we achieved devolution in '97. And I'd argue that places like CAT, I don't want to freight him with too much significance, but individuals like John Seymour and his self-sufficiency books, which John Seymour himself lived in North Pembrokeshire in the late 60s, and for most of the 70s. What we might, lazily call hippie environmentalism had a huge effect on how Wales began to define itself. It continues, I'd say, in things like the Future Generations Act, how tenable, how effective the ideals of that act are, I'm sure we'll come on to debate. But there is a sense that I think rural Wales, which was cheap, easy to move to, if you had some small means, terrible weather, often appalling conditions for living a life of self-sufficiency. But we have to recognize that during the 70s, there's a great period of inward migration for people who wanted to define Wales, and we can, I'd say their definition of Wales is as good as anyone's. As this place where environmentalism, where self-sufficiency, where agency through using the landscape was possible in ways it wasn't possible elsewhere. Next image, please, Kelly. I realise I'm rattling along, but with limited time. So 1984, we're back in South Wales. We have the cataclysm of the miners' strike. Mardy, a village that didn't even need a picket line because mining was so embedded in the community. They knew if there was a picket line, no one would ever cross it. So Mardy, no need for a picket line. And the solidarity, the display of social capital that was, despite its strength, so vividly squashed during the miners' strike, is obviously on display here in the solidarity of this women's group. And I think it's also worth mentioning that the miners' strike in some ways was gendered. I mean, there are men behind the women here, but there was a great deal of support from women, to the degree that obviously women's support groups. But the fact is, in communities unlike Mardy, it was a sense that the men had to occupy the picket lines and the women took care of what was happening at home. And obviously what was happening was home was incredibly grim when you have entire communities without any income and no recourse to any sort of social security. There is also at this moment, and this I think is overdone by historians, including by myself, but there is a moment in the mid-80s of a form of co-consciousness that means things like the miners' strike, the anti-apartheid movement, the founding of the Green and Common Women's Peace Camp, which obviously originated in a march from Cardiff, and the fight for the language for Cymraeg did sort of gel together across communities. And again, I think that could be overdone, but obviously the mid-80s is the point where Wales suffers incredible hardship as a nation due to the economic policies of a government that nobody or a majority hadn't voted for. It's hard to believe, but the Labour Party in Wales is one of the most successful governmental parties in history. It's been in power in Wales for 100 years. You can't say the same about England or the United Kingdom. So having a government, usually a conservative government, that is not elected by a population leads to these kind of tensions, obviously. And I think in the mid-80s, those tensions in Wales were beyond acute. Next slide, please, Kelly. We were good at some things during this period, and the Welsh Development Agency, which was far from perfect, in many ways quite a corrupt organisation, did do one thing incredibly well. Again, going back to environmentalism, it was a pioneer of post-industrial land reclamation. This is what one of the upper valleys looked like in about 1982. And after some investment from the WDA, it looked like, please, Kelly, next slide. This. That happened very quickly in 5 years. We had people from all over the world coming to see how this was achieved. We were absolute leader in this sort of thing. And anyone who's driven up from the A470 from Cardiff up towards mid Wales who remembers it before, you know, it is transformational. Obviously, the huge issue is the housing stock in this image remains the same, and the economic reality, despite the greening of the valleys, remains bleak for many. You know, it was an objective one area for many years, and it's an objective one area that benefited greatly from European emergency funds and voted for Brexit. Again, that's not a value judgment. It just speaks to a certain disconnection between economic aspirations on the part of people who assign grant funding and the lived experience of people who are from these communities. Have the final slide. This, if we talk about agency, if we talk about protest, if we talk about community, I think in Wales at the moment we can locate within the Football Association of Wales one of the most progressive drivers of social change in Wales. We have a young person, a person of colour, my Cymru, my shirt. It's worth noting a lot of the people in the Football Association of Wales have a Cymdaithiaeth background. They come from a protest background. They tell a story about Wales that I think is open to everyone to participate in. They deliberately ensure that tickets for their matches are cheap so that people on an average Welsh wage can afford to go and support their team. And obviously within the Walgoch, there's an LGBTQ section, there's a women-only section, everyone is welcome. It doesn't make us any better at football when we enter things like World Cups and only score one goal from a Gareth Bale penalty. However, there is a sense of dynamism and progress and agency within football that for people who aren't interested in the sport, I think would find very interesting. When Rob Page, the manager, did a interview about what it meant to be the manager, he had it filmed in one of the Slate Museum, I think, one of the National Museum of Wales places, and talked about remembering the bus drivers' strike in his community. This is an organisation that is very, very democratic and very communities led in a way that the way that language is animated by the Senedd fails to connect with people. It connects with people through football. Very briefly, Cymdaithiaeth, they asked for a television channel, they asked for a Welsh Language Act that would allow for Cymraeg to have parity in official documentation with English. It had one other, those two things it asked for were successful. The one other thing it wanted was a housing act, and funny enough, given our economy, that didn't come to pass. I think there's a very legitimate argument that once we have legislated for things like that, they lose their potency. So a lot of the things Cymdaithiaeth lobbied for, agitated for, were successful, but the energy was dissipated once it was taken into government. Southeast Wales, South Wales in general, Wales in general, we have lowest PISA score in terms of education. We currently have several organisations in freefall. Take your pick, S4C, the museums, the Arts Council, Vaughan, you know, take your pick. Is devolution worth working? I don't know. Was it worth fighting for? People did fight for it, and they demonstrated that change can happen through determination and defining one's social energy. Diolch.
Thank you. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Richard. That was fantastic. And I think picking up on the notions of agency, community, the drivers of change, change can happen through determination, perhaps, is the final remark that I'll pick up on. I'm conscious that I'd just like to say thank you. Would anybody from the audience have any first reactions that they want to bring into the mix, and then we'll move on. I saw throughout lots of Yeah, lots of responses, reactions. Would anybody like to say anything briefly? Yes, I can see Gwen.
I thought it was really interesting, the whole notion about the energy being brought into the government and how that energy kind of dissipated. And I'm from an organization that was built 30 years ago based on families having their loved ones in institutions. And we were born off of campaigns and protesting. And I've had to go back to a protest the other day and we were an organization that moved away from campaigning because we could just represent. And now we're back in a place where we need to start campaigning again. So I very much agree with that idea of that energy, because Wales, with your Wales strategy, we were pioneers. There were people moving over to Wales, bringing their families and their loved ones because Wales had the correct way of going about it. So it's really fascinating, actually.
Okay, thank you, Gwen. Would anybody else like to contribute? Sue? Yep.
Yes, sorry, I couldn't find the little yellow hand. I was going to ask, although Richard was covering, important part of history, whether reflecting on what's happening now in our communities, do you think that communities in some senses are taking charge of their own affairs, almost bypassing government in order to make sure that they are not living in an extractive economy and that they can actually manage their own affairs, acquire assets, and ensure that the community benefits, but you don't necessarily hear their voices in a traditional protest way. So the question I'm asking, really, in a long-winded way, is that are we, in a sense, seeing a change in the tactics of people who want change but will concentrate on their own communities and quietly get on with it, bypassing in effect policy wherever they can?
I'll answer that as briefly as I can. I completely agree with you. I can give two examples. There's Dyhead in Bethesda and other organizations in Bethesda that are producing their own energy. I think they're paying, I don't want to get this wrong, but I think they're paying at least 3 or 4 people a living wage to provide energy for their own community. Similarly, in Newport, there's an organization called Urban Circle who are giving a huge amount of agency to young people and recognizing that dance is a form of medicine, provides amazing health outcomes for young people. I mean, both cases, they do receive some degree of funding, but I would say in both cases, neither are funding dependent, nor have they been from their inception. I try desperately hard not to be cynical about these things, but when I hear politicians in Wales talk about communities, I really do shudder a little inside. I think that word community it does so much heavy lifting. It sort of implies a sense of recognition that we're in great trouble, and sort of implies a feeling of empathy, but doesn't offer any solutions. So I think you're exactly right that people in communities, however they define them, are looking for ways to bypass legislation. My one worry is I'm either in the last house in Wales or the first house in Wales. I live stone's throw from Offers Dyke, and I worry that I could go from here right to the Irish Sea. I go across here to Pembrokeshire, and every 6 miles I'd come across community organisations, particularly in rural areas involved in environmental solutions, and I'd find people who aren't connected and who are struggling to be connected and who are full of highly motivated, well-intentioned, often highly educated people, often highly competitive people, all of whom want to see the same outcome. But I've actually ended up scratching my head wondering if, and I can't believe I'm going to say this, an organization, a sort of arts council type organization for environmental activism, that people could actually have a framework to relate to join together, because we've all sat in so many meetings or gone on courses about how to do communities assemblies. And I think, in my experience, the ones I'm involved with, there's a sense of exhaustion now because this energy can't be harnessed effectively. So personally, I draw huge inspiration from people like Urban Circle in Newport, dealing with people who are probably likely to be on the sharp end of the policing system, and giving them better health outcomes through dance, and through people in Bethesda who are creating their own energy, not all of whom, but several of whom have a Cymdeithas activist background. So yes, I completely agree with it.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Sue, for your question and thought. Okay, I'm going to move us on. Thanks again, Richard. Diolch yn fawr iawn. And I feel that this is perhaps the start of the conversation, the start of something, so thank you. So I'm delighted now to introduce our next speaker, Yvonne Murphy. Yvonne has been a freelance theatre director, creative producer and creative practitioner and consultant since 1992, working across the UK and internationally. In 2008, Yvonne founded Oh My Days Productions and is the creator of the Democracy Box and the Talking Shop, two creative solutions to our current democratic deficit, which I think feeds in very neatly to the conversation just prior to this. So Yvonne's going to talk about bridging the gap between the people and the power, the Talking Shop and the Democracy Box. Over to you, Yvonne. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessie. So I'm just going to start by saying I wouldn't describe myself as a campaigner. I would, however, describe myself as an arts activist, which possibly amounts to the same thing. I went to what I now understand was an extraordinary state school, which placed creativity at the heart of its pedagogy and curriculum. But it took me to be in my 40s to understand that to be encouraged and facilitated to campaign and protest and take a petition to Downing Street while still in school was unusual, and that my work as a creative has actually been shaped by that head teacher's vision and focus on creative learning, which led to, amongst other things, taking the first ever piece of theatre to the House of Commons and creating the Talking Shop and the Democracy Box. Kelly's very kindly going to put my slides on, so thank you, Kelly. If we can start now. So I've spent the last 4 years solely focused on researching democratic participation. That's perfect, thank you. And developing and designing prototype solutions to help address our growing democratic deficit. And I've co-created those prototypes with 16 to 26-year-olds from all over Wales, including from the 5 lowest voter turnout constituencies. And the Democracy Box report was published this year, and you can find it on the Democracy Box website. I've recruited and trained over 70 young people to date as co-creators, and I've workshopped and focus grouped and surveyed hundreds more and listened to feedback from over 10,000 visits to Talking Shop trials across Wales. This talk's going to be in 2 parts. I'm going to talk about the problem and then a possible solution. So slide 2, please. The main barriers to democratic participation identified through my research are a lack of democratic education and information from school into adult life, combined with a frenzied focus on elections and voting. So to dismantle these barriers, we need large-scale democratic education and information online, in schools, and in community hubs. And we need young people and creatives to be paid as co-creators and democracy storytellers as part of this multi-platform education and local community solution. The Democracy Box research evidences that there's a knowledge gap for the majority of the population, and it also evidences that our current focus on elections is at best ineffective, and at worst, and rather ironically, may actually be contributing to our record low levels of voter turnout. Because why would you want to vote in a system that no one has bothered to explain to you? Engaging and mobilizing only for elections creates this cycle of wall-to-wall election coverage, followed by tumbleweed, and this cycle is leading people to feel powerless and excluded, and many feeling disillusioned with the ballot box being the only advertised or perceived method of participation. There's a popular misconception that people, especially young people, are not really interested in politics. However, young people and people of all ages are already engaged. And as we were just discussing, record low levels of democratic participation sit side by side with record high levels of activism and engagement, because people really care about issues affecting them and others at a local, national and global level. And I know from talking to thousands of people all over Wales that they really care about their local areas and communities. And yet, most people don't know who their councillors are or how to contact them, or that these elected representatives and their local government are deciding budgets and policies which affect the quality of their lives every day. Slide 3, please. As I continue, I'm going to share a few statistics with you from the Democracy Box survey. Young people told me that I needed to row back because they didn't even understand what the word democracy meant, or that the UK was a democratic country. Next slide, please. If people don't understand what a councillor, MP or member of devolved parliament does, or the difference between them, or how to contact them, or why they're going to be interested in an election or bothering to vote. Next slide, please. It's like asking someone to sit down and play a game of Monopoly or Cluedo without first telling them the rules. It would just be annoying, frustrating, and feel like a waste of time. And it's not just young people who are experiencing significant barriers to participation. It's across all ages. A common denominator is not having had the luxury and privilege of a kitchen or dining room table or classroom where the basics were discussed or taught. So the pressing issue becomes, how do we create this dining room table experience for everybody? So my research concluded that there's 4 key problems which are barriers to the change that's so needed. And they are the ivory tower problem, the managed democracy problem, the news media problem, and the status of creatives problem. Could we go back to slide 6, please? Slide 6, thank you. The ivory tower problem is created and perpetuated by anyone who currently understands how our democracy works and feels like they have a voice, but they're unconscious of or do not acknowledge the knowledge gap which exists for everybody else, for the majority. And this includes politicians, policymakers, civil servants, decision makers, journalists, broadcasters, funders, and key stakeholders and influencers. The ivory tower problem leads to basic democratic information and education not being prioritised and being under-resourced. By basic information, I mean the difference between local, devolved and UK government, who our elected representatives are, who's responsible for what, the difference between parliament and government, how our votes are counted, what devolution is, and the rule of law and the role of media. And just to say, we mentioned the future, the Commission for the Future Constitution of Wales. When that was first created, I was in touch with them regularly saying, you can't have a conversation with the nation because the majority of the nation don't understand how Wales is currently constituted. So we have to understand the basics before we can have that conversation. And I was delighted when they've published their final report that they had agreed and named democratic education as an absolute priority. Because a lack of basic knowledge about a democracy makes it impossible to participate meaningfully or at all. Or, as one talking shop visitor put it, next slide please, to make an informed decision, you have to first of all be informed. Now, obviously, if 100% of people are informed, it doesn't therefore follow that 100% of people are going to be engaged and participating. However, what is certain is it gives them the choice, and not giving the information they need to fully participate, and therefore not giving them the choice, is fundamentally undemocratic. And anyone in a position of power who is conscious of this information gap and consciously chooses not to address it leads us to problem 2. Next slide, please. The managed democracy problem. Poor information flow and the subsequent lack of opportunity for the populace to impact decision-making between elections could be defined as a managed democracy, a democracy that is reduced to elections and the people as occasional voters. That is where I believe we're at. So a managed information gap is fundamentally undemocratic, as is the decision to forget about people who have historically not voted or who traditionally vote against the government in power, whether that government is local, devolved or UK. The third problem, thank you for the next slide, is the news and media problem. So the main responsibility for democratic education within the media currently sits within rolling news departments, with some responsibility and budget being given to education. And one of the main problems with this is that democratic education becomes wrapped around flagpole or newsworthy events, mainly elections, when year-round democratic education and information is what's required. And the fourth and final problem, next slide please, is the status of creatives. So in ancient Greece, citizens were obliged to go to the theatre as part of their civic duty. Now, I'm not advocating that we should make theatre attendance compulsory in Wales. As a theatre director, obviously that would be great. However, I do believe, like the ancient Greeks, that access to and participation in arts and culture and creativity is vital to a healthy and democratic society. Next slide, please. We appear to have held on to and valued only part of the ancient Greeks' thinking about democracy, and the importance of ritual storytelling and creativity is somewhat undervalued and therefore underinvested within our UK society. And we need to accept that the creative sector is the third pillar of our civilised democratic society, along with state-funded health and education. And we need to invest in it properly and place creatives at the heart of our service and policy design. And it's essential that we begin to routinely invite professional creatives as well as young people to sit at every table and be embedded in decision and policy making and paid, crucially, for their time, knowledge and creative skills. So that's the problem. So here's the potential solution. I began by working out what the basic information was that everyone needed to know so that I could then share it with the young co-creators. Next slide, please. So I created the story of our UK democracy that every citizen should know in 7 short chapters, and you can view it and download it for free in Welsh and English. The story was illustrated and designed by young co-creators, and it's been fact-checked and approved by the Electoral Commission, who I'm also working with to update it now. The information is in a hero story format because my research showed that the best way to enable people to engage with dry and complex information is to use story. And this story is now the basis for all the democracy work and the 3 prototypes. Next slide, please. The first of those prototypes is the Democracy Box information campaign, which basically involves young people retelling the story in myriad ways across multiple media platforms and in person. The campaign is co-led, co-managed, co-designed and co-created by young people who are all paid as freelance co-creators and Democracy Box storytellers. And more young people are recruited and paid to attend creative think-ins and feedback sessions. Next slide, please. The Democracy Box information campaign has been branded by one of the young co-creators and can now be found on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. It has a website and a podcast series, and it has content also commissioned on BBC Bitesize. In-person events have been in-school assemblies, community events and sessions at higher and further education institutions. And you can find all of this work on the Democracy Box link tree, because no young people use websites, or the Democracy Box website, so I created that for people my age and older. The young people told me that having all the information across multiple media platforms under one brand was the top priority, along with this information being in schools. So I simultaneously designed the second prototype. Next slide, please. The Democracy Box Creative Cascade program for schools. This program enables primary and secondary school teachers and their students to mirror the Democracy Box Young Co-Creators process. So each year, students learn the story and then retell it and cascade it to the year below, using progressively more complex creative skills, mediums, and techniques. Next slide, please. The program was piloted in collaboration with Central South Education Consortia and 15 schools and was completed in February 22. My dream is for every school, first in Wales and then the UK, to have access to this model to create a strong foundation for all other democratic education and citizenship teaching. So imagine, if you will, 10 years from now, a student who's age 7, who's currently in year 2, will have been told and creatively retold the story of our UK democracy every year for 10 years. so that when they leave school age 16 or go on to do A-levels or college or whatever, they will have a sound basic understanding of our democracy and be empowered with ways in which to have their voice heard all year round and not simply at the ballot box. And they will have developed their creative thinking and creative habits of mind to stand them in good stead to address the complex problems which face future generations. It's not an expensive program to roll out. It's simple, quick and easy and cost effective, and it will create a strong foundation for the new curriculum in Wales. Next slide, please. The third democracy prototype is the talking shop, which I piloted in 2019, and that led to the creation of the Democracy Box. And then young people told me that as well as digital information and getting into schools, they also want the information in person and face to face. So we came back round to where I began with the physical space of the talking shop, and I put the Democracy Box inside, on the walls, on screens, and in bilingual booklets, which you can take away with you. So the talking shop is a cultural and democratic information centre, a place to find out what's on and what's what, hosted by professional creatives. I began trials then in 22 of the talking shop across Wales to create a blueprint of the model which would enable it to exist in any town. So the main aim of the talking shop is to tackle our democratic deficit and increase cultural and democratic participation, both at and beyond the ballot box. However, I began to realise very early on that the benefits of the talking shop model far outreach these aims. To date, the shop has evidence that the model can help us confront some of society's most pressing issues, including isolation and loneliness, mental health and well-being, polarisation, intergenerational connection, community cohesion, and urban regeneration. So, and also in the shop, I'm experimenting with a programme of creative participatory activities which act as both engagement tools into the shop and creative approaches to democratic deliberation. And I'm exploring how to take the result of those deliberations and conversations and input them into our existing systems and structures so that people can influence democracy and policy making all year round. We've now hit over 10,000 recorded visits, and we've trialled it in Cardiff, Newport, Merthyr and Blackwood, and the visitors range from 6 months to 96 years old, and they spread across all socio and economic demographics. And I really passionately believe that new money is not needed to make a talking shop sustainable and long-term. Rather, we need multiple stakeholders, including local authorities, health boards, academic institutions, public and regional partnership boards, and organisations across the cultural and democratic and public sectors to come together and repurpose their budget strands that they have for public consultation, engagement and participation in a more joined up, creative and effective manner, and actually create a living case study for the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Next slide, please. So to just finish off and conclude, and next slide after that, sorry, I missed that one. My research over the last four years demonstrates that we need two things. We need basic democratic education via public information campaigns, one-stop democracy hubs, and democratic education being baked into the school curriculum. And the second thing we need is to change our democratic culture and language and shift our focus away from elections to celebrating everyday democracy. So that's been a long 4 years. So at the end of that, I passionately believe that the Democracy Box is a public good. I don't want to fundraise and use philanthropy to make it happen. It needs to be co-owned and upscaled by organisations who have public service at their core. So I'm working hard to make the first long-term talking shop in Blackwood beyond the trial period. I don't know if I'll be successful, even though I've had 100% positive feedback from everyone who's visited it. The Creative Cascade programme for schools needs to be rolled out by all the local authorities, and I'm hopefully going to pioneer it in Gwynedd. Excuse me while I drink some water. And the ultimate aim for the Democracy Box public information campaign is for me to step away from it and it to be run by the BBC and the Electoral Commission. Today, this morning, while I was planning this, I received very disappointing news from the head of BBC Wales, and it's with a heavy heart that I'm going to announce to you first before anyone else that there's no plans for this work to be upscaled. And without it, the upscaling of the other 2 prototypes will be severely impaired. And the strain on a tiny non-core funded micro arts organisation and 1 freelance creative arts activist or campaigner, if you will, to facilitate and sustain this work has taken its toll. And today, with the news from the head of BBC Wales that they're not going to upscale it, I think I've hit one wall too many. So this protester and activist, I think, might be signing out post this presentation. I'll leave you with 2 questions. What value do we place on the health and well-being of our citizens and our democracy combined, now and for future generations? And can we really afford to not upscale the Democracy Box prototypes? Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Siobhan. I'm quite speechless. I'm feeling really sad. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that this sequence of events, after so much input and inspiration, has led to this moment in time. Yeah, I'm really moved. Thank you for sharing that with us. Yeah, I feel quite moved. I'm really sorry. It's very inspiring work. I hope that perhaps in some ways the conversation today might stimulate some of those threads, but very much appreciate where you've come to. I'm very mindful that in our workshop, these very concerns, these very sort of sadnesses that you're talking about are part of the workshop, and they're going to be explored. And I have real confidence in our facilitator Amanda to tackle some of these. So unless there's any sort of burning thoughts from the floor, I'd like to hand over. Unless, is there anybody who'd like to respond? I mean, thank you so much, Yvonne, for sharing that. It's a fantastic piece of work rooted in research and principles and values, and I absolutely support it. I want to make it possible. So thank you. Does anyone want to come in quickly?
Just fury, rage, to be completely honest, because it's such an important tool. I mean, I think some of the most disastrous things that have happened in the last years have been through elections and through the fact that people didn't know what they were voting for. I mean, Brexit for me is, I'm European, my family's in Italy, I can't go and see them. So my life has been drastically affected from Brexit, and the rage that I feel on a daily basis of the fact that people just weren't informed, didn't know. And working with the learned disability community, it should be so important for them to vote. It should be so important for them to have a voice within democracy. And so much of politics is inaccessible to them. And I'm looking through the Democracy Box now, and I'm like, damn it, this is so valuable and could have helped so much. So Yvonne, I'm sending you lots of strength, and there's a lot of rage behind this decision. And I will be speaking about the Democracy Box quite often now.
Yeah. Snap. Thanks, Gwen. And again, some comments in the chat. So sorry, shocking news. It's so impressive what you've done, Yvonne. I hope we can have this conversation again very soon. It only leads me to, unless there's another one, Sue, yes.
No, I was just going to say that it's absolutely shocking news, and it's typical of creative, great work that tackles key issues that seems to, stop because it's so dependent usually on grant funding, but also the failure of big organizations that have got the resources to actually pick things up and actually to continue with it. Unfortunately, Yvonne, it's quite typical of the world at the moment, isn't it? And it begs the question just how important it is to, is this to key people who could actually help to make a difference. I'm very cynical, about, governments as well, as to how committed they are to some of these issues and about education about it. Maybe if people were educated, they would also vote differently or behave differently. Do you know what I mean? I mean, that's a rather forceful way of putting it, but yeah, very shocked. And I hope that you'll come through it and that there will be some resource it's a critical piece of work, and I respect the fact that you want it embedded, you want it to be sustained, and you want the ownership to be more broad than simply sitting with you and your small organisation.
Absolutely.
So just to show solidarity, I'm wittering on there. Mm.
No, it's pure solidarity, and I think from across the board.
Yeah.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Sue. And thank you, Yvonne. I'm going to take us into the next part of the session, if that's okay. I would like to, at this moment, introduce Amanda Stone. Amanda Stone has been working for NGOs and leading campaigns for nearly 30 years. This includes work with Greenpeace to stop mining near the Great Barrier Reef, with ActionAid on reducing stigma on HIV and AIDS, and with Merlin to raise support for health workers responding to conflict and emergencies. Amanda has coached and trained UK and European charities on campaigns focused on human rights, and has lived in Wales for over 15 years. I'm delighted to now introduce Amanda to take us into the workshop. Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks, Jessie, and thank you to Richard and Yvonne. Actually, I was going to start in this way before Yvonne spoke, but I've done a lot of work for the Sheila McKechnie Foundation, which was set up to promote campaigning and the work of individual campaigners and also professional, that means paid campaigners who are working in organisations like Greenpeace and ActionAid. And they're also under threat. They've been under attack. They've been going 15 years. They were launched in memory of Sheila McKechnie, who herself was a founder of Shelter, but also brought the issue of asbestosis and the dangers of that to public attention and knowledge. She was a formidable campaigner who sadly died of cancer in her early 50s. And some of her friends, who included Gordon Brown and Alan Rusbridger, then editor of The Guardian, and John Snow, wanted to continue her work as a legacy. So I've been involved in Sheila McKechnie Foundation in different roles since the very beginning. And I had this conversation with the current chief exec, Sue Tibbles, only a few weeks ago. She almost said exactly what you said, Yvonne. She just feels almost completely defeated, although she doesn't want to be. Their funding has come under pressure. They've come under criticism from some of the trusts and foundations that have supported them. And I choose not to be cynical. I think as a campaigner, you have to, and I have been a campaigner for a long time, I think sometimes I can't afford to be cynical, but I can be angry, definitely, and defiant. And I also, part of the message today is to remind everybody that there are these forces, both subtle and sometimes extreme, working against us when we're trying to create change. And to me, I mean, there's many definitions of campaigning. It's it's like many things. You know, I could sit here and give you one, and someone else would have a different one. But for me, and for many people, it is about social change and social power. And sometimes, as both Richard and Yvonne alluded to in their presentations, which I really enjoyed, it is something that sometimes we might be the first to highlight or the first to speak out, and sometimes it's not welcome, sometimes it's not understood. And I take Yvonne's points on board that, you know, we have to do better at explaining sometimes why it's an issue and what the steps to change might be. And I wanted to start with that message today. And some of this is based on something called the Power Report, which Sheila McKechnie Foundation published. And it's available on their website, as is a fantastic new resource for all campaigners called the Changemaker Toolkit. That's been produced with Wikimedia UK. It's completely free as an online resource. And I urge you to have a look at that. I think, as Jessie said earlier, we will be sending out a list of some books and links, including that website. But there's some really important resources out there, and I urge you to take advantage of them. The toolkit is a very simple online learning resource many of you will be familiar with. But I ran, and Sheila McKechnie continues to run trainings on campaigning and particular aspects of it, like working with the law, for instance, or working with the media, advocacy, And something they introduced last year, which myself, I'm also a trained psychotherapist, I thought was a fantastic but rather sad indictment of what's needed, is people were increasingly talking about being burnt out as campaigners and needing support in how to manage themselves, how to pace themselves, and a space to talk. And when Jessie and Sue asked me if I'd be involved in this today, one of the reasons I felt it was important is I know campaigners, whatever you call yourself, activists, protesters, creative agents, we're all of that and more, sometimes can get very isolated. And I've had two great examples only this week. There's a campaign emerging, which I won't blow their kind of stage, but we'll soon be hearing a lot about it from this area of Pembrokeshire. And someone, because they know I've been involved in a lot of campaigns, and particularly with Greenpeace in Australia, asked me to just go through some of their campaign objectives. And I immediately thought of what's happening over in Suffolk, friends who are involved in the opposition to Sizewell C. And it's been going a number of years. Some of you may be aware of it, but there's plans to build an even greater a nuclear station there in a very rural area. It's a bit like my area of Pembrokeshire. The roads are tiny, small communities, area of outstanding natural beauty, very famous for bird watching in particular, but beaches, etc. And of course, the claims are that it's very important for renewable energy, for the future, for the UK. It's also, of course, the claim is it's going to create thousands of jobs. And when the campaign started, and it's actually an ex-Greenpeace colleague of mine, which is why I know a bit about it, who's been spearheading it because she's a local resident. They've got, they've done all the campaign things that we'd expect. They've got famous people, because there's quite a few who live in that area, actors and writers. They've got them involved. They've really worked the media locally and then managed to escalate that to national level. They've got scientists, experts talking about, of course, the environmental impact. But the thing that emerged that initially they hadn't talked about was the transport problems, bringing all of these vehicles that will be coming and all of these people who move to the area down these tiny roads, the impact that was going to have. And there was no plan for it. And that's often the case. And we've had that here in Pembrokeshire, in our area, where new homes are being built and there's been no consideration of the transport infrastructure. So that was an interesting learning. And my ex-colleague was on BBC only a few days ago on the news talking again against Sellafield C. And the message has kind of changed again. And I think this is important to remember, that we sometimes do have to keep changing the message. Because she's now saying, or they're now saying, she is the spokesperson, Alison Downs, is saying, but there is no guarantee where this money is coming from. And, same with HS2, the costs are going up for various reasons. We don't know where the money is going to come from to complete it. And I think it's very important and very timely that they're actually now using this as a sort of key campaign message. Whereas originally they were trying to contest the number of jobs that it would be claimed that would be created. So I wanted to, I think today, one of the things I feel very strongly about is that we all have to be campaigners about campaigning. It is under attack. It's often undervalued. It's often trivialized, as demos, protests, people getting angry, people doing stunts. This is the language that's often used. So there's a few things that came out of quite a long report from the Sheila McKechnie Foundation that I wanted to share with you. But before I do, I just wanted to invite anyone who's with us today who hasn't spoken yet to perhaps say something about how they feel about being a campaigner or the current climate for campaigning. Is anyone willing to say something?
I mean, I've already spoken, but I'd say it's terrifying at the moment, being a campaigner. Like, even just going to protest at the moment is really scary. You have police asking your name. Why are you there? So generally speaking, I've been an activist since I was 14, and I've never been more scared.
If I can just come in, that, you know, in the current environment, campaigning is often, you're facing a local issue, you know, very much that you feel strongly about. But if you look at some of the big questions around environmentalists, the methods that they're using often, I don't know, don't seem to resonate with the public. You know, they're seen as soft methods, using the arts, using banners, and, you know, the impression I get that people fall into two camps, you know, those that want to be, you know, want rapid change, they want to reason, they want to create pressure, they've got things to say, they've got evidence to back it up. And the sort of softer end, you know, is seen as slow and ineffective, at least in the short or medium term. Do you know what I mean? So for me, campaigning is such a mix at the moment. And, you know, we've had our fingers burnt here locally, trying to buy a community asset, blocked, you know, went very nasty. And maybe that's the other end of, you know, campaigning, you know, when things aren't running well and you're fighting for something, but you're maybe not paying enough attention to the relationships that they might take you on. I find it a very, very complex area and difficult to get it right at the local level. That's my impression. And at national level, some big organisations that shall remain nameless are almost losing their way in the way that they're open the public. I've covered a lot of points there, but that's a very personal picture, you know, of how I feel about campaigning.
Thanks, Sue. I mean, I think actually what you've just said chimes with some of the summary findings of this latest report, the Power Report. And one of the key things is it should be mission first. A lot of organizations are seeing campaigning almost as an adjunct to fundraising, which I had to fight against a lot in organizations I was working in, as if it was like an advertising campaign or just a way of raising profile. But then, of course, that came with all sorts of caveats of how it had to be toned down as well and couldn't ever be too political or too contentious. But I think it means more than that, this mission first, not money, because often the resistance to any campaigning, protest, call for social change is, well, how are we going to make it happen without the money? And I don't want to trivialize what we've just heard, particularly from Yvonne, about, you know, the difficulties of trying to also be in a position where you're doing something that could be sustainable for long term. But the problem is we only have certain channels to work with, and often those are almost in opposition to campaigning and social change. I mean, I've worked all my professional life with the media, and of course, some campaigns only chase media coverage, and that's increasingly become such a problem. And I think even more when I moved to Wales, when I realized if I can call them that, the English press, the national press, were not interested in success stories from Wales of successful campaigns. And I was very interested in what Richard shared, kind of giving me a sort of longer term context on that. But when I first started working with even the Sheila McKechnie Foundation, Sheila was Scottish, but the people who carried on in her legacy were sort of more or less saying to me, oh, we could go to Wales and teach people how to campaign. And I was like, they could teach you. They know more about campaigning. And that was a shock to them. And, you know, I'm massively simplifying and paraphrasing conversations that we had over a period of time. But to me, it was another example of this old kind of legacy, as Richard said, of, you know, Conservative versus Labour, and also difference across language and across culture, but also the problem of the media. You know, who speaks for Wales? Now, hopefully books like Richard's will and the work Yvonne's doing, and other people, but I think there's another job to be done, which is to constantly promote and publicize the great work that is being done here. And I don't know who could do that. IWA do a decent job, I think, up to a point. But again, that's seen as quite political, and not everybody's going to be, certainly younger people aren't going to be drawn to that. But if I just go through at this point, and I will stop to give people a chance to speak again, because I think it is important. And I've seen in the chat some people introduce themselves, and I'd love to hear from some of them. But so mission first, not money. So look at the bigger picture for the change, for the social change. And also make sure that you do really understand other people's position. And it's collaboration, not competition. And again, coming from some of the big NGOs in my work, I've seen that terrible competition. And I think it's changed. I was part of something called Stop AIDS, which was a coalition. And it was pretty extraordinary, the early meetings. And I don't want to shame some of those organizations, but they were literally trying to stop the idea of a coalition of all the big NGOs who were working on HIV and AIDS awareness, because they felt they would lose some of their profile and some of their fundraising potential and reach. Luckily, we got over that, but there were still a few who refused to collaborate. And I learned a lot from that, because in the beginning, people were saying, why would we want to work together? We're set up to be separate. And we were working on this mission first, not money. The money came later. We were lucky the Elton John AIDS Foundation actually funded this network. But I do agree with, and I think can't remember who said it might have been Yvonne or it might have been Jessie, but I do think, no, sorry, actually, it was Gwen. I do think there is some need for some way of bringing together, Richard, some way of bringing together organizations who are working on common community ownership or community asset or community campaigns. I think, yes, absolutely. I agree with you. I'm hearing all the time, because of my work in trying to share the power of campaigning, is that these things happening across Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, England, that we could all be learning from. But it's something that no one as yet is really able to take on. There's pockets of it happening, but I think that's important. So collaborating, not competing. I've already said, but I think building greater public understanding and support for civil society's work, and that's clearly what Yvonne's trying to do. But maybe sometimes we have to be very aware of language too, and not call everything campaigning or activism or protest. We need to be clever about that. And obviously that's the work we all have to do, which is make sure we change our language and our messaging for different audiences and for different purposes. But I think building civil society and solidarity is language that we also need to remember to use. Because if I go and talk to people locally, and I have done because I'm involved in local issues, and talk about campaigning, they will typically say, no, I'm not a campaigner. I don't want to do that. Because they either think it puts them at risk, as Gwen said, of being arrested or being recorded in some way, or being seen as anti in some way that they don't feel is their value. And it is about values. So I think it's finding language, but at the same time protecting and promoting that voice of civil society, and reminding people how important it is to speak, to campaign, and to protest in whatever way works for them. That's why, of course, so many people love petitions. It used to be sending postcards. And there's still a place for that. We still hear some politicians, it shocks me, but they will say, if I get enough emails or I get enough postcards or whatever it is, letters, it used to be, then I'll take it further. I'll push it up the chain. And we're all a bit like that. There is a way that we do respond to numbers or voice, but they don't respond to the loudest, shoutiest voice. And we've heard that time and time again. And I think to what Yvonne was talking about, we have to work harder to make the way we campaign more diverse and more inclusive. And it's great to hear, Yvonne, you were saying that you're paying young people who participate. That's also now being talked about more and more in the sector. You know, if we talk about giving voice, my original work with ActionAid, we always said that's what we were doing. We were giving voice to people who didn't have the chance to speak at the table you mentioned. Now we all work harder, I think, or I hope we do, to try and actually have some of those voices in the room, not just represented. But then, yes, what about paying them? You know, I was there being paid. Why shouldn't they be paid? And now there's even talk of some trustees who have lived experience. This is the language that's come into use. I'm not sure about that because we've all got lived experience. So I think we have to be careful about that. But bringing people onto boards or onto advocacy groups or discussion groups, yes, we need to be mindful, just as we do in a local community. Why would someone get involved in the council when they've got 2 or 3 jobs and they've got children, childcare, and there's no reward for them financially, and they're giving up a lot of time? So I think this all for me comes under strengthening diversity and inclusivity, sorry, making words up, and definitely making sure it reflects the community. I mean, there's a sense here in our part of Pembrokeshire, and I'm talking about that because it's where I live and where I'm involved in local issues. There's still this idea that it's a retirement area and it's all for old people. And the young people, I don't think are included enough. They're not talked to enough. I'd love Yvonne to be able to bring what she's doing. And I hope we could have a conversation about that, maybe with Sue Denman as well. But why aren't we talking to them? Why don't we find out what they want? I mean, I was involved in a meeting a few years ago at the secondary school in St David's, which is the secondary school for our area. And there was a small breakout group at a table. And as Richard alluded to, there's a lot of people who are very active on environmental issues in this area of Pembrokeshire. It's fantastic, lots of new ideas. But again, a lot of those sort of 14-year-olds, 16-year-olds don't feel that they're ever involved in conversations. And they even complained about their school didn't have proper recycling at that time. And when I spoke to the teacher afterwards about this, he was very dismissive. It's like, oh, well, you know, we do other things. We plant trees. Oh, you're not listening to what they're saying and leading by example. So why would you expect them to get involved in, you know, bigger debates and bigger actions? So I think that's something that we can all continue to do better. I think the other thing is that, and Sue, you touched on this, is there's people who want quick wins and quick fixes in terms of campaigning. And then there's others who realize that it's a really, really long road. And that takes energy. And I don't think it should fall on the shoulders of any one person. It can't, or any small group. And when we talk about sustainable campaigning, that has to be considered and factored in. And just actually before we started today, I saw a tweet that had come in from Compassion in World Farming. And they're saying, we can hardly believe that after 50 years of hard-fought campaigning, the bill to ban live exports from Britain has passed its final stage in Parliament. So it's not something I've been involved in, but I just thought, wow, 50 years. I mean, I'm kind of speechless. But, you know, again, today I've had tweets from friends who work on HIV and AIDS awareness still in Africa. And it's something I moved away from a number of years ago because I went to live and work for Greenpeace in Australia. But, you know, many people think, oh, that we've done that's not an issue anymore. And of course, funding for treatment is a massive issue, and access to treatment is a massive issue, and livelihoods is a massive issue. And there's still stigma in many parts of the world, and people are still dying, you know, in greater numbers than they did from COVID. So there's a way that people who campaign, if they feel very passionately, they have to learn to pace themselves, I believe. I had to learn that. And also form alliances, perhaps sometimes pull back to come forward again, to have breaks, whatever that might look like. I don't know if anyone, haven't had a chance to look at the chat. I know there's been a few comments. When you said, I find the fact that charities have to remain politically neutral. Yes, absolutely.
Worked for various charities, and every time I've been kind of muzzled on speaking my mind, but also, you know, these charities are affected inevitably by the political situation, because we're very aware, I think, that these charities in a Tory government wouldn't get as much money as under a Labour possible government. And obviously these are speculations, but this is following what the values of the party should be. And the fact that I think of the last general election when it was Corbyn and Johnson, and the silence from so many organizations who would have been affected by these decisions and were, and here we are. Many of those organizations are not here with us anymore.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Someone also in the chat, I'm just trying to see who it was, said...
Sue Leonard, Amanda has got her hand up. Sue Leonard.
Yeah, hi Sue. Sorry.
Hi, Amanda.
Hi.
I put in the chat about, you know, having your voice heard is one thing, but getting it listened to is quite another. And what I see a lot in, so I work for a county voluntary council in Pembrokeshire, as it happens. And, you know, I know that in Pembrokeshire, we do have a really active youth assembly that is run through the education team and so on, but it does tend to appeal to a certain demographic of young people. And of course, once you've left school, then what do you do? You know, so but you know, what we find is that we're often asked to help various partnerships to find citizen representatives to sit on board on the partnerships. And you know, when I first started, which is sort of 20 years ago with PAVS, I was really keen on all of that, you know, and really trying to support people. But then, you know, over time, I'm now looking at and thinking, I'm not going to bust a gut to do this unless the partnerships are prepared to listen to what those people say and actually take notice. Then what all they're doing, you know, if I can't be convinced that it's no more than box ticking, which I'm afraid in many cases it's, we need to have a, you know, we need to have someone who's unpaid carer. I take Gwen's point, and you know, somebody with learning disabilities and somebody with, so they various population groups, and then they come around the table. But unless there's no investment, there's no payment of time, there's no resource to support those people to be able to contribute effectively. I'm really taken by, you know, you can't make an informed decision without information. Yvonne, I think, said that. You know, it's that that there's we need to be, there needs to be much more. And a lot of talk about co-production, and all of the talk is right and all the legislation is right in Wales, but the action is not right. And I don't know quite how we can change that. So I found this afternoon absolutely fascinating, actually. Yvonne, really thank you for your presentation. I'm actually sitting on a ministerial task and finish group looking at the democratic health of town and community councils. I don't know whether you've given evidence to them, Yvonne. No. Sure, if with your permission, I'll certainly flag up your work to that commission, because, you know, because one of the things that's coming through loud and clear through that, the whole reason the minister wanted to set up the task and finish group was because of the lack of you know, involvement, people standing for election and wanting to get involved in that tier of local government that's really close to community, town and community councils. And it's just come through loud and clear with engagement work with young people, is they haven't got the first idea what we're talking about. Not the first idea. And you know, and I wouldn't want to say that, I mean, I did some work up with in the college with Tom Moses, and you know, the kids just didn't know, and they've got to vote. You know, at 16, a lot of them will be able to vote in Wales in certain elections. They haven't got a clue how to exercise that vote, and most of them said half of them didn't know they could, and then the other half, quite a few of them said they weren't going to bother, because what was the point? everybody was as bad as each other. But a real lack of, I won't say lack of interest, but a lack of knowledge. I love the idea of that cascaded learning across 10 years in schools. That would be perfect.
It sounds like what you
It
said.
works.
Sorry.
Sorry.
And it's obvious, isn't it? You know, it obviously would work.
It sounds like, Jessie, when you said you hope there may be some further conversations, there's definitely space for that.
I think so, and it's perhaps a good moment for me to come in. I think many of everything that's been said today, I think, resonates for many of us, whether that be around the personal experience that drives us towards creating some change. Sue Denman mentioned a local campaign. It's how Sue and I met, around the sense of shared vision, but that experience of burning out, feeling isolated, feeling alone, but that ambition for collective fight in the hope that the things that we say and do might be heard. Certainly across the session today, I can see sort of sparks of inspiration. We've got a couple of minutes left before the session comes to an end. I don't know, Amanda, have you got some sort of concluding words for your sort of presentation, and then I can round things up at the end?
I think I just want to quote actually Sue Tibbles, the Chief Executive of the Sheila McKechnie Foundation, and they give out awards every year to all different kinds of campaigners, from individual to organisational, and they're on tonight. If I wasn't with you, I'd have gone to London to be part of it, but I'm going to join it virtually tonight. But she said recently, pressure's coming from so many sides. We're all juggling as campaigners an extraordinarily diverse set of competing stakeholder interests. And of course, the challenging environment for campaigners, with police and obviously legal measures being used to kind of close down and stop some of the conversations as well. And as I said, I think some funders, unfortunately, are also joining in on that. But I still think that we all have the capacity, when we come together, to deliver transformational change in individual lives, communities, and society as a whole. And we're not going to stop. I think we've just got to form new alliances and new ways of working. And I think Yvonne's example is a great one, because sometimes you actually have to change using the sort of existing channels and stakeholders. And one thing we did with a project that I took around the world to raise awareness of HIV and AIDS was we worked with leading photographers from each country and journalists to create an exhibition that went to places like the South African National Gallery, and was opened then by Nelson Mandela. And just to have, at that time, ministers actually standing alongside pictures of people with HIV and AIDS in hospital in New York and London, the message came through: this is solidarity, this is affecting us all. But we also took that out to shopping centres. It was hanging from trees in townships, because the media weren't willing to actually show these images to begin with. So we had to find, in a way, our own, the equivalent of your box. We took our box around, which was photography. And then, of course, we're invited to the UN, and suddenly everybody did want to publish the photos. But that was over 20 years ago. But to me, that's an example of sometimes we have to change how we campaign and who we can rely on to actually get the message out. And that's why I love what Yvonne's doing, but I think also Richard's doing it through his writing and his book as well, and reminding us of what's gone before. So thank you, I think, and thanks to everyone who contributed. And I hope other people have got something from it, and maybe will want to follow up, or maybe we can stay in touch in some way. But thank you.
Lovely. Thank you ever so much, Amanda, for providing that summary. And I think today's been very powerful. I think, well, I certainly feel that. I nearly burst into tears earlier. And so at the end of sessions like this, sometimes it's really nice to have a go around the room and people say how they felt, but we don't have the chance for that. But if you felt like putting 3 words into the chat about how you've felt today, it could be hope, anger, grief, desire, inspiration. If you feel like putting 3 words into the chat, how you feel right now, it can be anything, it might reinforce that sense that I think there is some solidarity here amongst us, and there is that sort of collective ambition for change. As Sue Leonard says in the chat, it's not as if we don't need to change. So I think that's the note that I'd like to leave on. Just thank you all ever so much for coming on behalf of Together for Change, PAVS, and the Resourceful Communities Partnership. We do have some other events coming up, one on the 6th of June, which is about learning from emergent economies, and also some Seeing is Believing events throughout June that will bring to the fore some of those fantastic examples of some of the work that's happening in Wales. And I look forward to continuing the conversations that have really just been started today. So thank you ever so much. In the chat, as we fade out, inspired, hopeful, determined, challenged, content, rage, hope, reinvent, informative, anger, hope, interest, humbled, inspired, passion, feeling emotional by what I've heard. And thank you. So thank you ever so much. As the credits now roll, we look forward to speaking and keeping in touch with you all very soon. Thanks ever so much.